Hello? Hello?
Hi.
Hello?
Hi. I can hear you.
We're going to start in just 1 minute. So if anyone wants to leave the room, you can. If people want to stay, you're welcome as well. Great, thank you very much. And welcome to this side event discussion on just protein transition for sustainability, biodiversity and the climate. I'm David Garahy, I'm from World Animal Protection, and we're hosting this side event today with our partners, Humane Society International. Today we will hear from 3 speakers before handing over to you in the audience to discuss this topic. You're very welcome, and please do tweet or communicate on this debate using the hashtags you can see over my right shoulder. Oh no, you can't. Well, they are Food for Climate and Bonn Climate Conference. So maybe to give you an introduction to this debate, the IPCC report, which was launched last month, the 6th assessment on mitigation was, I think, the latest message to us as policymakers and activists that the world needs to shift towards diet with a heavier concentration of plant-based proteins and a decreasing consumption of meat and dairy. This would also would be good for diets, would also be good for sustainability, but it would lead to substantial decreases in greenhouse gas emissions from the dairy and meat sector. The IPCC stated that plant-based foods have the greatest potential for greenhouse gas reductions. I think it behoves us to try to understand what that means, both for policymakers and for the different actors that will be involved in the just protein transition. We're going to start with our first speaker, who I'll introduce. Steve McIvor is the Chief Executive Officer of World Animal Protection. He oversees my organization and our twin goals of global food systems transformation and ending the use of wild animals as commodities. He's an experienced executive, both from corporate and the NGO sector. He worked with Body Shop on much of their campaigns and other international organizations. He has over 30 years experience in communications and campaigning. So I'll hand over to Steve to give us an introduction to this topic.
Thank you, David. I like the introduction. Hopefully you can hear me clearly in the room. I'm sorry that I can't be with you in Bonn today. But good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you to the UNFCCC for allowing us to organise what I believe is an absolutely vital conversation. This afternoon's topic is a just protein transition for sustainability, biodiversity, and the climate. But I want to propose an amendment. Our start point at World Animal Protection is to consider what a just protein transition means for those most impacted by our broken global food system, the animals. It is their future that I'm here to argue for, and as we'll see today, it is intrinsically linked to our own. Here's one version of that future, which you may have seen in recent press coverage, that featured dairy cows fitted with face masks to reduce some of their methane emissions. This is the work of the industry-backed Zero Emissions Livestock Project, and according to ZELP, forcing these animals to cover their faces is, for the planet, or the animals for the future. I'm sharing this with you because I wonder if it prompts the same reaction in you as it did in me when I saw this story a few weeks ago. How on earth have we got here? How have we got to a place where permanently masking animals is presented and broadly accepted, indeed awarded, as a positive development? How detached have we become from our responsibility to animals, their needs and their welfare? And how desperate are we to believe that technology can somehow make cheap factory farmed meat part of a sustainable, healthy future for ourselves and for our children? The reality, of course, is that factory farming cannot be the future. ZELP, backed by the global meat industry, is funneling money into this project because profits depend on convincing us that factory farming can provide cheap, plentiful meat without dire environmental and ethical consequences. It's an empty promise from a broken system. In the next few minutes, I'll show you why we must change what's on our plates, not what's on a cow's face. That the scale of human-induced suffering is now beyond crisis point. That the deep connection between animal welfare and the well-being of our planet is impossible to ignore. And that as we all look to COP27, we have a unique opportunity for change. Let's get started. When I say that we are at a crisis point, it's no exaggeration. The global factory farming system is a uniquely damaging triple threat. First, and you'd expect me to say this, but first, it is the single biggest source of animal cruelty on the planet. Driven by our desire for affordable meat and dairy products, 77 billion land animals are used for farming. Over 3/4 of these are trapped in intensive farms. These animals are manufactured and processed as products, forced to live in unnatural environments, enduring extreme physical and psychological suffering. They are denied everything that is normal and natural for them. The scale of the suffering is alarming, and its very existence should shock and shame us. But it is also doing untold damage to our planet. Second, it is the single greatest cause of wildlife habitat destruction in the world. The crops required to feed those tens of billions of animals now dominate the world's land use. Animals consume more than 3/4 of global soy production. 1/3 of land used to grow cereals is for livestock. The devastating link between deforestation and agriculture is already well understood, but we are less attuned to the real problem. Crops used for animal feed or land used to farm animals now accounts for nearly 80% of global agricultural land use. The disastrous deforestation and habitat loss that we have witnessed is not even enabling a shift to more plant-based diets. It is simply fueling our appetite for more cheap meat. Third, it is a massive contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, but it's largely being ignored. The desperate sight of cows burdened with masks is just the tip of the iceberg. Already, the livestock sector accounts for over 14% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Without action on global meat consumption, rising demand for animal feed will see food emissions consume the entire world's carbon budget necessary, keeping global temperature rises under 2 degrees centigrade by 2050. We are already rapidly approaching the 1.5 degree limit set by the Paris Agreement. And the inescapable fact is that without action to tackle industrial farming, we are guaranteeing wrong outcome. The cruelty is out of control. The threat to the sustainability of our planet is undeniable. And if that assessment feels bleak, I make no apology. But my message today is, in fact, one of optimism. Because, as evidenced by this gathering, I believe the world is waking up. I'm optimistic when I look at my children and their friends. It's unthinkable that future generations will accept a food system which traps tens of billions of animals in a cycle of abuse that is hardwired to create catastrophic environmental harms. We're already seeing changes in consumption and demand for meat driven by shifting personal values and a desire to improve our lifestyles. And as we can see, ethical supply is beginning to follow more ethically driven demand. I'm optimistic that views on climate, which not so long ago were on the fringe, are now the mainstream. The status quo is actually fast becoming the radical position. I'm optimistic because we have emerged from a global pandemic with a new appreciation, the shared vulnerability and interdependence as a species, and the realization that the way we treat animals is intrinsically linked to our own lives and our own futures. Most of all, I'm optimistic because the world's response on climate proves that deep-seated systemic change is possible. How people behave, the way businesses are run, where capital is allocated, what policies governments enact. Our responsibility is to seize this initiative and accelerate the change we see around us. There has never been a better or more urgent time for action, built around 3 priorities. Proving that factory farming has no future. We have to expose the fact that factory farming's true costs and how the system is harming and not feeding the world. In August of this year, World Animal Protection will add to the evidence base through its carbon life cycle assessment report, examining the emissions profiles of different types of farms. Creating a food revolution. We want to encourage the shift to plant-based proteins that the latest IPCC report recommends. Changing the incentives so that factory farming is curtailed and investment flows to more and more humane and more sustainable food production systems. We have already seen the positive impact of deforestation and methane pledges, and today we call for governments to take forward a just protein transition pledge, which I believe can embrace our own campaign for a moratorium on factory farming, a commitment from governments to stop approving new factory farms now. A call echoed by Asian civil society represented here today, who want this moratorium to safeguard their environment, health, and rights. I hope today marks the beginning of a renewed focus on factory farming as we look toward COP27 in Egypt, something which is crucial if together we are to end the suffering of billions of animals, protect the world's most valuable habitats and biodiversity, and reach our climate goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, for that very enlightening and I think a call to arms to us for us to take seriously the impact of industrial farming. I'm going to call next on Nithi Nesadurai to give a speech. Nithi is the Director and Regional Coordinator of Climate Action Network Southeast Asia. He's also the President of the Environmental Protection Society of Malaysia and is a regular attendee at COPs for many years. He edited ECO, the CANS news bulletin, which many of you will have seen on the tables recently. And he was also co-organizer of the inaugural Just Transition Forum, which happened in Asia this last September and will happen again next September. He also participated in our Just Protein Transition Forum, which World Animal Protection hosted in March of this year, and which he'll present right now. Thank you, Nithi.
Thank you for the introduction, and hello, everyone. It's my privilege and pleasure to present the Asian Protein Transition Communique. It is the outcome of the Just Protein Transition in Asia, Pathways to COP27 and Beyond Summit, organized by 50 by 40 and World Animal Protection from March 28 to March 30th this year. So before I get into the summit and the communique itself, I would like to quickly touch upon the organizing team behind it. Both World Animal Protection and 50 by 40 are organizations working globally on issues ranging from food systems to animal welfare. Their experience as well as expansive partner network puts them in a unique position to lead such an initiative. WAP has a legacy of over 55 years of working in the animal welfare space with strong roots in Asia. 50 by 40 is a catalyzing force for bringing together diverse stakeholders through a food systems lens and has quickly grown into a network with over 40 organizations. Now, the main objective of the summit was to bring together various stakeholders aimed at uniting civil society actors working across the protein system in Asia and co-creating a shared vision for a just, sustainable, and humane food system. The summit is an attempt to bring the voice of the Global South to the UNFCCC Forum and highlight what a just protein transition can look like in a region as unique as Asia. In the weeks leading up to the summit, representatives from 40 regional societies working on climate change, public health, finance, smallholders, human and consumer rights came together to map out the negative impacts of how protein is currently being produced on different thematic areas and to identify potential pathways for a shift towards a just, humane, and sustainable protein system in Asia. Now, if you look, you can see here a few of the organizations that took part in the pre-summit conversations, and we would like to thank all of the 40 organizations for their time and insights. We have learned an incredible amount about the food systems in Asia from them, and while the findings of the pre-summit conversations paint a bit of a bleak picture of the state of the food system in Asia, it is also very hopeful that there are so many skilled experts working on solutions. Now, the pre-summit conversations led us to the 3-day Just Protein Transition in Asia Summit, at the core of which was shaping the communique, a synthesis of these deliberations that calls on world leaders at COP27 to put a halt to further expansion on factory farming systems and to recognize that a just, humane, and sustainable protein transition is crucial to ensure that our global food system is in alignment with the goals of the Paris Agreement, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the objectives of the UN Food Summit and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Within this context, there are many reasons why protein transition is critical to Asia, and why, when the transition takes place, it needs to be just, humane, and sustainable. So first, Asia is the largest meat-producing region, accounting for about 45% of total meat production, with significant growth in the production of pork and poultry forecast over the next 10 years. The region will account for 53% of global trade by 2029, with the greatest increases originating from the Philippines and Vietnam, from Southeast Asia, the region where I come from. This growth will have a direct link, just to put it in context, this region, Southeast Asia, was said to be the next coal pipeline of the world, and now the next fossil gas pipeline of the world. So it's not a good scene for Southeast Asia, which is known as a very bubbling economic region. This growth will have a direct link to increasing the region's climate change emissions. Livestock production globally already accounts for at least 14.5% of current global greenhouse gas emissions. Under a business-as-usual scenario, livestock production is projected to take up to 81% of the global 1.5-degree GHG budget by 2050. Research estimates that in a business-as-usual scenario, greenhouse gas emissions from meat and seafood consumption across Asia will grow almost 90%, from 2.9 billion tons CO2 equivalent to 5.4 billion tons CO2 equivalent from 2017 to 2050, which is extremely frightening. It is promising that 13 of the 112 countries which have signed the Global Methane Pledge, agreeing to cut methane emissions by at least 30% by 2030 compared to 2020, by 2030 compared to 2020 levels, are from Asia. Yet, when we take a closer look at the 5 pledging countries from Southeast Asia which signed the pledge, no targets have been set to reduce methane emissions in the NDCs. So it almost feels like a hollow pledge. Hopefully things will change. Other factors related to animal production and consumption include human health, especially from the perspective of antibiotics use and non-communicable diseases such as cancers and diabetes, respectively. The use of antibiotics in factory farms is set to more than double in Asia in just over a decade. The use of antibiotics in poultry and pig farms will increase by more than 120% by 2030 based on current trends. Also, diets high in animal-based foods are one of the main risk factors associated with the rapid rise in non-communicable diseases, including cancer and diabetes. It is estimated that the current trajectory of population growth and rising incomes across Asia will drive a 78% increase in meat and seafood consumption by 2050. Other factors affecting animal protein production include preserving and improving livelihoods, respecting food justice, and upholding human rights. I will not go into these because of time constraints. So, these facts highlight the urgency of transitioning away from animal-based to plant-based protein. When the transition is made, the principle of equity and fair shares should be applied as follows. 1. The transition of the food system should be guided by the UNFCCC principle of common but differentiated responsibility. Consumption of factory-farmed meat and dairy must first be more substantially reduced in countries where there is high per capita consumption. 2. Subsidies of factory farming should be redirected towards supporting low-income countries and communities and workers within the industrial livestock system through the transition. The communique titled Asia Civil Society Call for a Just, Humane and Sustainable Protein Transition is based on the following sequence. 1, rationale, which covers the topics I've just gone through, and 2, a call to action, which is targeted at world leaders at COP27 and parties at UNFCCC. In summary, for a transition of the protein system in Asia, the communique's signatories call on the UNFCCC to develop and support the implementation of a global, just, humane, and sustainable transition in agriculture, which transitions away from factory farms and increases global public climate change spending on transitioning to just, humane, and sustainable forms of protein production. 2, investing in research to define the specific benefits of a shift to a just, humane, and sustainable food system to our climate and economies. as well as increasing public awareness and literacy of food systems and the impacts of industrial livestock to facilitate a diet change towards a more just, humane, and sustainable protein consumption. And one of the best arguments to make for the shift from animal-based protein to plant-based protein is to show there's a very good economic argument to do so for governments. We also call on member countries to stop further expansion of factory farming to enable food justice, nutrition security, greenhouse gas reduction, and biodiversity production, and adopt the goal to halve animal protein production and consumption by 2040 to reverse the destructive impact of land use changes and deforestation caused by the global livestock and feed production, impacting biodiversity and human health, including the impacts of marine ecosystems, of industrial fisheries and aquaculture, while recognizing the core benefits to climate adaptation and resilience that reversing these impacts will have, including strengthening smallholders and protecting ecosystems. Before concluding, I would like to come back to a timeline for the overview. I'd like to inform you that following the launch of the communiqué, we will be having a post-summit conversation to continue our collective mission where we will workshop an advocacy strategy for taking the communiqué to COP27. And this would probably be part of that action. Apart from this, an African summit with a format similar to the Asian summit are also on the cards, the dates of which will be communicated soon. With regard to SB 56, there will be value in engaging with the Coronivia joint work on agriculture, including their workshops and meetings, and inserting language on reducing global animal protein production and consumption into these discussions. This will provide a useful pathway to COP27. So it is my honor to launch the Asian Protein Communiqué on behalf of Asian civil society. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you'd like a copy of the communiqué, become a signatory or participate in the upcoming events, such as the advocacy planning or the Africa Summit. Please feel free to get in touch with us through the mail IDs mentioned on the screen. And this is a glimpse of the summit. So thanks, and back to you, David.
Thanks so much, Nithi. And it's so exciting to see this conversation happening right across the world and such bold demands, but very, very relevant ones. So very excited to see what the next installment of this debate is when the African Summit happens, hopefully in the autumn. Great. So we'll go to the last speaker now before we go to you, the audience, for your input, questions, and any comments you have. Stephanie is going to speak next. Stephanie Moe is a public affairs and campaign officer at Humane Society International, which is a global animal welfare organization. Their plant-based solution team work with governments to increase the acceptance of plant-based food. And Stephanie works across different governments and different government policies in relation to animal welfare. And she's based in the UK. So Stephanie, we'd be very interested to hear your presentation. Yeah. And I understand there's a video as well at the start of your speech.
Yeah, sounds good. I'll just move the... Excellent. Thank you, David. That's lovely. Right, so yeah, thank you, David, for your kind introduction, also for inviting me to speak today. Yes, before I begin, I would like to start with a short video. This video narrated by US animal advocate, thank you, narrated by US animal advocate and musician Moby, talks about the proverbial cow in the room of climate negotiations, industrial animal agriculture.
Well, I'm not going to sing a song like Moby could sing, but yeah, I think it's just I think it's just about to come. Maybe while we're waiting, does anybody have any initial questions or things that they found surprising in the speeches so far? David? Yes, David.
Can go.
Yeah, go. Mm. 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 Yeah. Nithi, do you have maybe? I don't know.
Sorry, shall I go back? I think that's very interesting, David. And you mentioned this to me when we met yesterday, and that's exactly the kind of reports we need, to show the economic justification for the transition and the benefit, the alternative livelihoods, and the benefits that will come from it. So yeah, because the most effective way of convincing, the sort of decision makers and policy makers to make the transition is to show that it makes economic sense. There's economic justification for it, and it's actually going to benefit the people. So it's great. And somehow it's come from the ILO. What will be interesting around there? Yeah, so, I mean, of course, they've been doing tremendous work on just transition. So, I think the ILO carries a huge banner, and it's will lend a lot of weight to their findings, the fact that it's come from the ILO.
Thank you, Nithi. Yeah, and I think there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of what the practical aspects of a just transition look like in terms of jobs, in terms of social impact, in terms of environmental impact. We need to learn a lot more about what it does and what impacts it might have. Yeah, so I absolutely agree. It's a plea for more information and more study into this.
Take two.
There we go.
I'm passionate about reforming global food systems for so many reasons, but mainly for climate change. When talking about animal agriculture, meat and dairy production, to people, a lot of times they're not aware of the environmental consequences. Intensive animal farming raises and kills more than 88 billion land animals for food every year globally, emitting huge amounts of greenhouse gas. The same amount as all forms of global transportation combined. Is also responsible for over half of all nitrous oxide emissions caused by humans, which has nearly 300 times the global warming potential of carbon dioxide. By 2050, farm animal production is projected to emit over 2/3 of the greenhouse gas emission levels considered safe. And it has other devastating environmental impacts: deforestation, soil damage, water pollution, and biodiversity loss. Everything we care about depends upon and relies upon a stable climate. Ultimately, you have to address these issues or these issues destroy us. At the United Nations Climate Change Conference, animal agriculture is not on the agenda. Tell our world leaders it's simply time to stop ignoring the cow in the room.
Excellent. So now the video we've just seen is not new. HSI actually first screened it at COP26 in Glasgow last year. And the facts about industrial animal agriculture that we see in it are also not new. Animal agriculture continues to be a leading cause of the ongoing and ever worsening climate and nature crises. So what has changed? What has happened since world leaders last came together here in Glasgow last year? In my presentation, I want to focus on methane emissions and also on the unique role that dietary shifts to more plant-based proteins and a global reduction of livestock numbers could play in achieving the Paris Agreement goals. I will also showcase some of HSI's global work, and I want to highlight what actions we need policymakers to take, both on a national and an international level, to future-proof our food systems by supporting a just protein transition. Next slide, please. So first of all, why do we need to tackle methane emissions? Well, methane is one of the most potent climate pollutants. It traps roughly 86 times more heat per mass unit than carbon dioxide over a 20-year period. While carbon dioxide emissions to date have caused global temperatures to rise by 0.8 degrees Celsius, methane emissions have caused 0.5 degrees of warming. Yet methane is also one of the most short-lived greenhouse gases, staying in the atmosphere for only about 12 years, whereas CO2 stays for hundreds to thousands of years. By reducing methane emissions, we therefore have a unique opportunity to significantly slow the rate of global warming, giving us more precious time to achieve a longer-term transition to net zero. As Barack Obama said in his address to the parties at COP26, curbing methane emissions is currently the single fastest and most effective way to limit warming. In addition to slowing global temperature rises, cutting methane emissions also has huge health and economic benefits. According to UNEP's Global Methane Assessment Report, readily achievable methane mitigation can prevent 255,000 premature deaths, 750,000 asthma-related hospital visits, 73 billion hours of lost labor, and 26 million tons of crop losses globally each year. You can really see how relevant that is, given the global food and health challenges we are facing today. Next slide, please. So how does this relate to livestock? Livestock and the supply chains that support the livestock industry is one of the most significant emitters of methane. Why? because both the digestive systems of ruminant animals, such as cows, sheep, and goats, and the use of animal waste as fertilizer produce vast amounts of methane. The Global Methane Assessment Report shows the livestock sector is responsible for 1/3 of all anthropogenic methane emissions. Indeed, livestock-related emissions linked to animal protein production emit more methane than any other sector, including oil and gas production. And with meat and dairy production forecast to increase, our current animal-centric food system risks fueling the methane emergency. The IPCC's latest report found that more methane has been emitted from enteric fermentation and manure than from oil and gas in the past 2 decades, quote, mainly due to the increase in global total animal numbers. 2021 saw a record increase in methane levels in the atmosphere. Now, considering that the COVID-19 pandemic significantly reduced global economic activities, that is really surprising and a cause for concern. Next slide, please. So, what needs to be done? It's good to see that methane is increasingly becoming a focus area for climate leaders and change makers. For instance, as my speaker before mentioned, the Global Methane Pledge, which was launched at last year's COP, is now supported by over 100 countries, as well as financial institutions and others. However, when it comes to the livestock sector, existing efforts to reduce methane emissions focus almost exclusively on targeted measures, such as new methane abatement technologies. They ignore the potential to reduce emissions by addressing the overproduction and overconsumption of animal protein and reducing livestock numbers. Yet these are the areas where cuts in emissions can be the most impactful, lasting, and readily achieved. For example, the adoption of healthier, plant-rich diets, among other food-related measures, could reduce methane by 65 to 80 million tons every year over the next few decades, according to UNEP. Methane emissions must be reduced by 45% this decade if we want to keep 1.5 alive. And we cannot afford to ignore the cow in the room. So what does this mean? The science clearly shows us that we need a global transformation of our food production systems and policies, as well as consumption habits, for both human and planetary health. Indeed, the IPCC has stated that policies operating across the food system, including policies that influence dietary choices towards a balanced plant-rich diet, would not only lower greenhouse gas emissions, they would also allow for more sustainable land use management, result in greater food security, and improve public health. A just transition from animal protein towards more plant-based protein should therefore be at the very heart of climate mitigation discussions, including the ones here at Bonn over the next couple of weeks. Next slide, please. Now let me look at, or tell you about how Humane Society International is inspiring change on the ground. We at HSI offer a plant-based solutions program that demonstrates how a shift in procurement towards healthier, plant-rich models can be achieved. We work directly with food service professionals, public and private institutions, and individuals across North America, South America, the UK, Asia, and Africa. Our aim is to increase awareness of and access to plant-based options. Our teams provide a wealth of free resources and services. We deliver culinary training programs. We create plant-based recipes that reflect local cuisine, palate, and ingredients. We support menu development and marketing, offer educational sessions and workshops, and deliver greenhouse gas impact assessments. Direct replacement of animal-based proteins with plant-based offerings is one of the most effective strategies to mitigate the environmental footprint of the catering supply chain. It can also have widespread influence outside the sector, improving public health through the benefits associated with consuming more nutritious plant-based foods and reducing the number of animals raised and slaughtered for human consumption. Next slide, please. Let me give you just one example of HSI's work. In Brazil, our teams are working with municipalities on implementing plant-based initiatives at scale. HSI, in collaboration with Mercy for Animals Brazil, has partnered with the municipality of Salvador in the northeast of the country to transition 20% of all meals served in 444 municipal schools to plant-based. Once fully implemented, this will result in over 10 million plant-based meals served per year. And this will mean each year more than 75,000 tons of CO2 emissions are saved, more than 16,000 hectares of forests are saved, and more than 400 million litres of water are saved. So as I said, it's just one example of how our programs provide a practical model of how amending procurement policy, as recommended by the Climate Action Pathways, to put more plants on plates can work at scale. Next slide, please. So what should policymakers be doing? Governments and global leaders must adopt cross-policy actions to support a more resilient, plant-centric global food system, addressing both supply and demand, consumption and production in tandem. We need national action plans, like the one announced by Denmark at the recent World Food Summit, with concrete and ambitious measures to support diet change. Achieving a just protein transition means leaving no one behind. Therefore, we need to shift subsidies and financial incentives from livestock production to more plant-based and sustainable agriculture to support farmers and also make healthy diets more accessible. We need to foster and promote innovation and growth in the protein landscape. And by reforming national dietary guidelines, governments can support consumers in making healthier, climate-smart food choices. Over the coming 2 weeks in Bonn, global leaders must also step up their international commitments. If we are serious about meeting the Paris Agreement and the SDGs, a meaningful shift towards plant-rich food production and consumption needs to be clearly identified as a valid and effective climate mitigation solution. A food system transformation, specifically a just protein transition, needs to feature center stage in the upcoming negotiations, including the Global Methane Pledge, the Corolivia Joint Work on Agriculture, NDCs, and other climate commitments. We need governments to set science-based targets to cut emissions, both through technical measures and by reducing livestock production. It's time for us all to step up to the plate. It's time to stop ignoring the cow in the room. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. And I think it's just inconceivable that decision makers and politicians aren't facing up to the challenge that you've laid out so clearly there, and to the clear solution that a just transition can provide to the world hurtling towards 1.5% temperature increase, 1.5 degree temperature increase. And it both makes me angry and mystified as to why there isn't more debate around this, the necessity for this transition. And it's really great what HSI are doing to work with municipalities, work at the local level, and that's wonderful and that's necessary. But we need systems change as well in order to ensure that this that we don't doom ourselves as humanity. So I think like thinking about that human aspect and thinking about just transition and maybe some of the aspects you brought up, David, about the human rights and or the human aspects of this. We have Hayley St. Dennis here from the Institute of Human Rights in Business, who is going to give us a little bit of an introduction to the aspect of human rights that's linked with this just transition. Hayley, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Really a pleasure to be here, and I came to learn as much as anything about this sector, and learn I really have. And congratulations for putting justice at the heart of this discussion, which the concept of the just transition, albeit a reference in the Paris Agreement and gaining a bit of traction in certain sectors, we're not yet seeing kind of mainstreamed within every single discussion here at Bonn and what we hope to see at COP27. And this is an example of exactly what we need to be seeing in these conversations. So I was asked to come and bring a bit of a sort of just transitions perspective. The Institute for Human Rights in Business is a think tank. We work with business, government, and civil society on the role of business in the world, both for people and for planet. And for us, the just transition is really the intersection of a world that is both highly carbonized and highly unequal. And so that does put justice right at the heart of what we try to do and bring to these conversations. And the agriculture sector is perhaps second only to the energy system in terms of the decarbonization work that needs to be undertaken. And so I think that it's very clear that the sort of plant and cell-based protein sector is going to play a key role in this sector's transition. And we heard a lot about the benefits of this sector bringing alternative livelihood models, for example. And I think that is something to really hold up as an advantage in making the case for this transition, which is going to be a bumpy ride. And not doing that, sort of emphasizing the role that your sector can play in ensuring a smooth labor transition from the animal kind of protein world, will only kind of delay uptake of your sector's reach and growth. And in that, I would certainly encourage embracing the ILO's Just Transitions guidelines, which is all about transitioning the workforce in a smooth way. And I think there you would find incredibly powerful allies that would really help make the case for this sector's sort of growth and ultimate reach and commercialization. And I guess the flip side of the coin, the first being that there's a very strong case this sector can make in its contribution to the just transition, is also that no sector is immune from human rights risks, and not staying on top of those risks, proactively preventing them where possible, mitigating them where some slips through, and remedying that which does, is a really key part of the just transition in every sector. And so the sector that you all focus on, the sort of plant and cellular-based agriculture sector, itself will have human rights risks that need to be managed, be it in the supply chains, in the farms, and in the fields, whether that's, farmers' exposure to, say, toxic chemicals, or the migrant labor force that gets used and brought in from around the world to help drive those global supply chains. Those risks are classical in the sense of many other sectors having learned a lot of hard lessons about the do's and don'ts of sort of getting business and human rights right. And so I think there's a very rich body of literature that can be drawn from a lot of other sectors, not just the sort of traditional agriculture sector, but many others that this newer sector here can learn from and really try to get right from the start. And again, I think that would be an enormous advantage in helping the case that you've been making here be heard and seen in sort of alternative fora and sort of outside the bubble, as it were. And I think that's really key to winning the argument and winning hearts and minds as well. And every sector needs to start somewhere. It really is a journey. And so leaning into what can be quite a discomforting space, human rights can be a scary word and scary language, but there's a very strong framework that you can actually use as a key tool in making the transition as smooth as possible, both for your growing sector and for the world's transition as well. So I'm happy to share any resources I can, any organizations that have a lot of that sort of experience in how to approach these challenges and really try to aid the cause. Thank you.
Super, thank you, Hayley. That was very insightful. And it also challenged us to think about the full consequences of what we're calling for here today. Does anybody else have a question before I go back to the speakers on what you've heard about just protein transition, what that means? Any viewpoints? Any questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm a student in agriculture, and I had a question whether you had a concrete vision on how to support farmers for the transition, whether it's just switching the subsidies to farmers that then starts with the plant-based farming, or whether you had other visions that would support the transition. Thank you.
Right. So maybe on those two inputs, Stephanie?
I think on the first point on subsidies, I'll give a kind of example of the UK, since that's where I'm based. The UK has introduced the environmental land management schemes. So they are a way to help farmers shift to more sustainable methods of production. And they feature several initiatives under them. And things that they include are things such as improving soil health, growing hedges, growing trees, so getting more biodiversity into fields in that way, which is fantastic. But again, one big omission in those incentives is, how to get farmers on that journey from industrial livestock production over to, more plant-based agriculture. And so there's one perhaps particularly glaring example is the Sustainable Incentive Scheme, which really, the title says it, this should really be the place where governments give financial incentives and financial support to those farmers who are saying, I understand that industrial livestock production is not a future-proof system of farming. I think, I think we can trust farmers. They understand, they can see the consequences of what's going on. And so we need to give them the support and take them along onto the journey, give them also, apart from, I think, subsidies and finance, it's also about, the knowledge, the technology. And I think that's probably particularly relevant in countries, such as, countries in Africa or other countries where perhaps that technology doesn't yet exist. I think it's our responsibility to make sure that that knowledge is shared globally so that farmers globally can move on. And to come back to also one point I think that Hayley made earlier, which was interesting, about sort of, the need to support farmers. We know that, yes, animal agriculture is a leading contributor to climate change, but we also know that's one of the sectors that's most vulnerable, most at risk. Those are the people who are facing, changes in weather patterns, they're seeing water scarcity, they're seeing droughts. Those are all things that are, mean that they can't sort of continue as they are. And so we really need to come in there and support them, make sure that it's a just transition, as you said, take them onto that journey. And I think one way of doing that, really importantly too, to make that happen, is we need a cross-policy approach. So in the same way as you were saying, we need sort of human rights sort of across, the various sectors, it's the same when it comes to food systems. We have to stop siloing them into one particular area. It's time to understand that food system cut across, environment, health, business, all of those different areas. And therefore we need governments to be more ambitious and have sort of a broader picture understanding of what needs to happen. So yeah, hopefully, we'll see some improvements there in Bonn over these coming weeks.
If I could add on to that, wearing my hat as, the head of the Environmental Protection Society Malaysia, our focus is on creating an institutional framework to mainstream sustainability. And that's across, it's horizontal integration across all ministries and agencies, and vertical integration across all different levels of government, from federal, state, and local. And the objective is to have this policy coherence, because you can't have federal government fixing one policy and state governments doing what they please, and without this coherence. And I'd just like to draw on another example as well in making the just transition. And your example from the municipality, I thought was very valuable. And even, sometimes like the question was on how do you do it? Is it redirecting subsidies? Sometimes those questions, are hard to answer without doing some sort of sustained study. So for instance, what's happening, we all know, like the sort of coal is bad. We need to transition away from coal. Yet, one of the projects, how is that going to take place? We know the experience from Europe or Germany in particular, where it's very, very much linked to the workers. So yet not enough has been done on what are the impacts on communities. So for instance, we are Climate Action Network, Southeast Asia, together with a consortium featuring the International Labour Organization, the International Trade Union Confederation, Wuppertal Institute, and the International Institute for Sustainable Development. We're doing a 4-year project starting in September, Innovative Regions for Just Energy Transition. So we are going into 2 active coal mining regions for 4 years to actually work with the community, get their inputs on how this just, humane, equitable, sustainable transition is going to take place. And CANSEA's job is to engage with the communities, because many a time the focus is all on the coal mine owners. They do well, you know, they receive subsidies in a transition, you know, they look after themselves. Workers, you know, the workers, and then of course, when we look at the sort of capital, government workers, they actually probably about 20% of an actual community. The 80% of those who are dependent on that particular community. You know, maybe those providing catering services or retail. Our focus is to go and engage with them. And then again, you know, it's like, how do we make sure that the voices of the most marginalized communities, the women, you know, the voiceless, how do we incorporate their views into this transition? So I think some sort of that kind of effort may be required when we want to make the transition from, you know, protein to animal, from animal-based protein to plant-based protein. This kind of detailed study where we really go and, you know, integrate, engage with the community to hear what they have to say, and then use that as a basis to come up with solutions. So I'm really excited about this ability to go and engage, because there's very little knowledge and literature on communities' inputs on making that alternative livelihood transitions, that just transitions, and, you know, to then do the study and share it with the world, and then use it as a model for transitioning away from coal into green activities across the world.
Yeah, I mean, the just transition, it takes a village, it takes everyone that's in a community to input into that. For sure. I'm wondering, Steve, do you have any input maybe on the human aspects of animal agriculture and how that impacts and what a just transition could look like?
I guess, David, I mean, you know, I was reflecting on this conversation. One, it reinforced, you know, the importance of looking at the issue of farm animal welfare and its interrelationship with issues like climate change, human rights, etc. Very much through that systems lens. There's such an interrelationship. We have to be mindful of that. One of the things that is clear is that you know, it's not only animals that suffer through what I would call an exploitative system right now with industrial farming, but actually it's true of many in the farming community. And of course, since we've seen industrialization sweep around much of the world, we've seen the impacts on numbers of farmers. We've seen people displaced from their land. We've seen, you know, resources, you know, diverted away from many to the few. And I think, picking up the point that was made earlier, we need to ensure in this next transition that we don't leave people behind, and especially the most vulnerable people, because climate change is, you know, is not only going to affect obviously our livelihoods, but the most vulnerable people live in places like Asia. They live in places like Africa, and therefore it's incredibly important that you know, we address climate change on a number of different levels, from an animal and a sort of human point of view. I think, other than that, I was just reflecting on some numbers that just have sat with me since I was looking at this issue in preparation for this conversation. I was just going back to the issue of greenhouse gas emissions and looking at some percentages that tell us, I think, how profound the difference can be between, you know, generating sort of plant protein versus animal protein when it comes to emissions. And the Good Food Institute did a study recently that put some, you know, I think, interesting estimates in that showed that greenhouse gas emissions, you know, if we move to plant-based, will deliver something like a 47 to 99% reduction in the amount of land that is being currently destroyed, if you like, as a result of our current farming systems. It's a huge number. 72 to 99% less water being consumed. And we know that water is in many ways the new oil. It's going to be the substance that wars are likely fought over. And it will lead to 30 to 90% less global greenhouse gas emissions. So, I think every which way you look at this issue, from an animal welfare point of view, from a human rights point of view, from an environmental point of view, that the statistics stack up so powerfully in favour of profound change. And yet, I think picking up Stephanie's idea of the plate, the issue of industrial agriculture sits very much on the edge of the plate right now, and we absolutely have to make it central. It is, if not equivalent to, it's very close to equivalent to the fossil fuel industry, and yet we treat it as if it is a marginal issue. It's not.
Thank you, Steve. And I think those numbers really bring home like how central food systems are to this debate, and how and how far they are from the center of the debate is really is quite worrying. Are there other questions or comments or inputs to our panelists? David.
Yeah, thank you. I forgot to mention earlier, I'm David with Slyke and Trust, a think tank based out of Sri Lanka. It's called Just Protein Transition, right? And I think we sort of agree on the proteins we're talking about. There's a variety out there. There's the traditional legumes, traditional plant-based proteins. Then there's some more sort of processed in the veggie burgers and so on. That's really taking shape. And there's this big boom we're talking about, right? Where basically the benign invisible hand of the market is sort of driving that forward. We're seeing that in the US, Europe, Asia. There's just this called the Veggie Burger Ban campaign run in the EU, because a lot of the traditional industry wanted to put some like a stick in the wheel of it, and saying you cannot call it a veggie burger. You cannot call it anything that put that on the product. When something's made from plants, you can only call it if it's made from an animal, and so on, right? And I think they actually got away with saying you cannot call it milk now based from plant-based milk. We've been calling it coconut milk for a while. There's no contention there, but so there's like the market forces slowly pushing that agenda by itself, right? We're already seeing flexitarian sort of a big movement around that. A lot of people are shifting diets, are becoming much more aware as consumers, and sort of voting with their money and their plates. So that's already to some degree happening, and then of course there's a lot of work to be done to accelerate that effort. But that can be done through sort of paving the way by not making it by shifting subsidies and other things. So just like how to say, equalizing the market access of these new products. But what you're just talking about is also like a just transition, and that you talked a little bit about farmers and a lot of other communities. So as a sort of contrast to the invisible hand of the market and maybe helping that a bit, could you elaborate a little bit more on what you're then bringing to the table with the whole just transition, and what does that include? Is that a clear enough sort of question to sort of elaborate a little bit more on? Because in Asia, it's already booming, this market, right? And there's a lot to do to invest, but wouldn't that just come from private investors who are seeing the market potential? What is sort of being brought in by the just transition angle into all of this, and how does it look like for farmers what do they shift? When we have coal miners, it's sort of, for me, an easy image saying, okay, we just kind of pick them up from horrible working conditions. There's a reskilling process. They learn to install solar panels or windmills, but it's a little bit more diverse, right, when we're talking about agricultural production. So what does the just transition in this sort of protein add to it? If you could elaborate a little bit more on that.
So if maybe I summarize your question, what's the difference between what's happening already in terms of transition and the transition that we're proposing?
Yes.
Is that kind of it?
Yeah, there's already a market boom, right? That's already going on to some degree, right? But yeah, where does the just transition come in, and what are some of the mechanisms and benefits?
Nithi, maybe as you were involved in the communique preparation, maybe some of the ideas that came out of that underpin a just transition.
Yeah. Well, I think what is in the communique was more general. So in a way, it's hard to answer your question again without actually doing more research and really interrogating what you are asking. But I'll make 2 points. One thing is creating the market. So there are 2 things. The push factor and the pull factor. So what I'm saying is that we know this situation is unsustainable, the way we create animal-based protein at present. So people know there needs to be a shift. And the business, the sort of, the investors, the big mega companies have gotten into it, realizing they know that this thing is going to happen, and so they are creating the products. And they've done very well. They've become they were the dream of the investment community at one time. And what they are doing is, instead of regular burgers, they are producing burgers which are very much like regular burgers. They look and literally taste very much the same, except that they are made from plants, which I find very hard to eat. So what that does is, then it creates the consumer shift, so that people who go like, oh yeah, I know that I really don't want to eat meat, yet I really like eating meat, I miss meat, and so, I will have this alternative meat or alternative milk. So in a way, that's also important, because then it creates the shift for people, who want to transition away from eating meat. I mean, they find it difficult. And this is also linked to providing more opportunities, and this is also the awareness of this has also driven more restaurants and all to offer vegan options, or just to provide totally vegetarian and vegan options. So that drives people away, and so you create your critical mass. And I'm really amazed, I mean, like, we know it, like in Germany, the awareness, when we were in Scotland, in Glasgow, when we arrived for COP26, oh, here's a map of all the vegan restaurants in Glasgow, and there were like 20 of them. And that creates the market. So suddenly when you have more of this available, more people will go. And even in a country like Malaysia, every week, literally you get an article, saying like, oh, we've got to shift to vegan food, vegan-based, plant-based diets. And that awareness is being created. And what you hear, more restaurants opening up, and even the traditional, very meat restaurants are offering. When you go there now, it's like, oh, do you offer vegetarian options? Would you like to see a vegan menu? So that's also important in creating that avenue for people to shift. And then as people eat more of this and they go, like, this is actually quite good, we should stop, because we should transition towards, we should eat less meat. So, so in a way, what I'm saying is that those investments, even though it's, it creates the market, and hopefully that will also be one of the factors which will enable this transition towards, plant-based proteins.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Stephanie, and then I'll go to Steve.
Fantastic. Yeah, just to add on to what Nithi said. I think, so with HSI, our angle is to especially deal with, say, schools, universities, as public catering services. And I think you have to understand them too as part of that just transition. If we say take schools, universities, we've got a new generation. We've got the next generation where we've got a chance to actually teach them about plant-based proteins, because I think there is still, although things are shifting, I think there is still this idea that animal proteins are superior to plant proteins. And I think it's really vital that we come in and we explain why that isn't the case, that they are nutritionally extremely valuable, that they are better for the environment, that they are soil fixers, and all of those things. And I think so getting the young people on board is part of a just transition, because they are the consumers and food producers of tomorrow. And then I also think the other kind of aspect on the just transition is giving people access to plant-based foods. When we go into universities, whether that is in Brazil or in South Africa or in the UK, we often come across, say, a university campus where there's not a single plant-based option on the menu. And I think we need to start understanding that in a sense of these are people who've chosen, whether for environmental reasons, health reasons, or ethical reasons, to reduce their meat and dairy intake. And they are not provided with access to those kind of meals. And that too, I think, is an issue of justice, of rights. And I believe, we're talking about kind of the challenge of getting policymakers to listen to what we're saying. And I'm hoping that by kind of connecting animal welfare, environment, and those human rights together, we can make that message heard. So by pointing out, it's also a question of people not having the right to choose what they want to eat in places where the governments are funding the food. We're talking about public procurement, hospitals, nursing homes, schools. I think that's a big problem, and I think that's where we can sort of show that this is somewhere where policymakers need to make a difference and connect all of those dots together for the just transition.
Thanks, Stephanie. Thank you. Very, very good point. Steve, any reflections on a just transition and what that looks like?
I don't think I can add too much to what colleagues have said. I think I'm, like others, also learning about what a just transition could look like and some of the ingredients of that. But to my mind, one aspect that I think is key is learning the lessons of those who've gone before. The diets that we've had in the West, for instance, we already know the effects of the path that we've been following, with cancers, diabetes, obesity. We're starting to see some of those lessons being learned in other countries. I was reading a story the other day, which on the one hand was saying that in Kenya, we have food poverty. On the other hand, we have obesity. And it's this sort of lack of information, the lack of and this division that's being created that I think we need to face up to and push back against. And some of that clearly is about providing people with opportunities, options, and the right information. But it's also not blindly following the path that was set, if you like, by the Americans and their food culture, if you can call it that, so many years ago that's led us down what I think is a very poor path. So just transition will be to do the opposite of that. The other piece that I thought was interesting is the psychology of how we message and market and engage people. Very often we talk about, I think, David, you were just talking about the way that there's a sort of momentum picking up around alternative proteins, and that's true in certain parts of the world, but it's still small scale compared to the challenge. We've not reached what we would call peak meat yet. Imagine peak oil, we've got peak meat. It's still coming, and it's still coming because of the rapid growth of industrial farming, actually in Asia in particular. We need to stop that and bring that point closer in time. And we can do it by actually using some of the psychology of the food industry and the retail industry, not just in informing people, but in actually making the alternative choices attractive and putting them not in the side shelves, but on the main shelves in stores. There was some recent work that showed, for instance, that when alternative milks were put alongside dairy milk in the fridge cabinets, that actually 90% of that milk, those alternative milks, are now purchased from those fridges, whereas when they were in the side shelves on their own, in the sort of, if you like, holier than thou, this is the nice healthy place, the sales were very niche and marginalised, and we have to treat, we have to treat those alternative options, seriously. There was another interesting example for me was about how you use language, and I think it was the example that I read about the other day was about, I think, Sainsbury's, UK retailer, who had taken one of their veggie sausages and completely repackaged it and made it sound as if it was any other type of meat. Their sales went up by 76% because they focused less on healthy and vegan, and they focused more on texture and taste. The words that are used, like crispy and juicy, by the meat industry. So there's lots that we have to do on a just transition. There's lots we have to learn, and I think there's a lot we have to do, not just to produce the alternative proteins and the cultivated meat, but actually to get it into the marketplace, to get it there for the right price, to get it into the right places, and to market it in a way that makes it attractive and stops industry continuing to marginalise what we're trying to do.
Thank you, Steve. I think that's a very important point about the message we're sending regarding a just protein transition, and how that how that links with humans and their needs and their desires and what they need, as well as nourishment. Well, with that, I think I'd like to thank all the speakers for their contributions today. I thought we heard some interesting calls. I think for more discussion and research on the human and other impacts of a just protein transition, about ensuring a community approach, that everyone is included in this discussion, from consumers to farmers to producers to industry, and also very much at the kind of the individual level. Why not a pilot project about a just protein transition in some countries or some communities or some regions that would really look at what this means, and how much we can learn from a project like that. I think we can learn a lot from the fossil fuel transition that has happened over the last number of years, but I think we can also learn about the health impacts that you raised as well, Steve, around the health impacts of meat, and how we can communicate about that in a way that makes people change their behaviours and encourages governments to highlight the health importance of meat. And I think this question of what a just transition really looks like is something we have to think about a lot more. And I like the rights kind of aspect that was raised a couple of times, that people have a right to healthy food, they have a right to access sustainable food at a local level, and they have a right to access that. And I think those kind of aspects could give us a lot more insight into what a just protein transition really looks like: rights, access, health. So yeah, with that, I'll close the session. Thank you all for your presence, for your questions, and I thank you especially to the speakers for your very, very insightful presentations. Thank you.